The Apostle Paul reminds us over and over and over again that we are one body. We are one people. And when we first hear it, it sounds wonderful, right? We are one body. We are one people. We think about those bodies that we belong to. We think about maybe our families that we belong to, or maybe the workplaces that we belong to, or maybe community groups that we belong to, or a group of friends that gathers often and we laugh and enjoy each other's company. That feels like being one body. But we also know that being one body can get messy and complicated. Imagine the Thanksgiving table with our extended family, or imagine those difficult moments in the workplace where things don't seem to be going like they normally do. Or imagine the carpool line at your child's school when you get frustrated both at the person in front of you, but also at the way this whole thing is going. Being one body is indeed amazing, but it's also complicated. It's absolutely complicated. After all, we're different people. We view the world differently. We think about things differently. We have different experiences of life and of faith. And so being part of one body requires a certain set of practices to help us stay attuned to what it means to be together, especially in these days when we recognize that we truly, deeply need one another. Whether we're talking about our families or our workplaces or the marketplaces or being the body called the church, it helps us to remember what it means to sustain this life. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have disagreements, or it doesn't mean we're all going to think alike. It means that there are certain practices that might help us rehearse being one body through difference, through disagreement, through different ways of looking at the world. And that when we do this, when we remind one another of these ways of being in the world, that something happens. We are transformed, and we actually feel more deeply connected to these bodies that we are a part of in our everyday life. And so Paul reminds us that one of the key practices is humility. He says, you have been called with all humility and gentleness. Yeah, he also says, with patience, bearing with one another in love. So a key practice of being this one body together is humility. And often in our society, we struggle with that word. We think humility might be weakness, or might be letting people just do whatever they want with us and in our lives. But what humility truly means is that we recognize that we don't have all the answers. That our way of looking at the world is not the only way to look at the world. That there are other perspectives around us. And so when we worship together, or when we sit around a table to have dinner together, or when we're in a restaurant or we're in our workplace, it might be helpful every time that we gather with these bodies to remember humility, to pay attention, to listen carefully, to begin to get a sense of how others view the world. When we do that, we get more deeply connected to one another. And that humility then brings that gentleness that Paul speaks to us about. Because when we recognize that there are other ways, we find ourselves more willing to listen to that other and to kind of see what they might be thinking about, how they might be putting their world together. And so we tend not to be so uptight all the time. wanting our way to be the only way. But also, we must be patient with one another and bear one another with love. Now, one of the cliches that you hear all the time is that, don't ask for patience because then you're going to be given it, right? In other words, that in order for us to grow in our patience, often we have to go through a lot of difficulties for us to get there. And that's certainly true. But my hunch is that if we paid attention, we constantly have opportunities in our day-to-day life to practice that patience. For me, patience means taking a deep breath. For me, patience means slowing down a bit. When I feel some of that anxiety creeping in my bones. When I find myself like I'm pushing my coworkers a little too much. Or maybe as a pastor, maybe if I feel like I'm pushing you as a congregation a little too much. Patience, when I think of patience, it reminds me just to slow it down just a little bit. To allow some space for life together to emerge. Conversations, for that nonverbal communication to be able to be seen. Allows me to listen more carefully so that I have a better sense of what's really happening here among us in this community that I'm a part of. So patience indeed requires practice. But it's not impossible. In other words, by the power of the Spirit of God, we are able to indeed enter into these spaces in these kinds of ways. And then as we practice patience, then we're being called to bear one another in love. Here at First-Plymouth, we say love first. So love is something that deeply grounds us. It's part of our identity, and that love that we believe comes from God can truly sustain us. And I would say it is that bearing one another in love that actually activates the Spirit of God that it's in us. So when my patience fails, and when my humility fails, and when my gentleness fails, that reminder that I'm a person called to be a bearer of God's love in the world comes in and allows me to be more fully present, to be able to be part of this body in more faithful ways. And so I'm inviting you on this day to lean on that love. Now, love doesn't mean that we get it. Love doesn't mean that we can easily explain it. Love doesn't mean that we agree with one another. Love means that we recognize God in one another, the dignity of one another, and that we can recognize that we belong to one another, that we are interdependent upon one another. And so when we bear with one another in an attitude that's filled with love, it connects us. It binds us together and allows us to live a life together as a body, one body, sustained by that love. So people of God, go into our world this week and pay attention. Practice humility. Practice gentleness. Practice patience. And if all of that fails, remember, lean on love. For it is that love that will give you all you need to be reminded of our belonging to one another, that we're not alone, that it's not just that God is with us, but that God's presence is seen in these bodies that we belong to, in our congregation, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, in our marketplaces. And that, being one body, begins to change absolutely everything. Amen.